At first glance, this story looks boring. It looks like paperwork, a military purchase, another government contract with a big price tag and a complicated name. But that surface view is misleading, because this is not really a story about fighter jets. It's a story about power, about who controls critical national decisions, and about how much real choice a country actually has once it signs on the dotted line. Think of it like this. Imagine signing a 40-year mortgage for a house before you're allowed to see the full inspection report, the long-term maintenance costs, or the fine print that says the bank can change key terms later. On day one, everything looks affordable, predictable, safe. But decades later, you realize the house came with strings you didn't fully understand, and walking away is no longer an option. That's the kind of decision Canada is facing right now. On paper, the debate is about replacing aging fighter jets. That sounds technical, necessary, almost routine. Countries do this all the time, but once you look past the headlines, something much bigger comes into focus. This decision locks Canada into financial, legal, and strategic commitments that will shape the country for generations. This isn't just about what flies in the sky. It's about who holds leverage on the ground. When a country commits to a weapons system this complex, it's not just buying hardware. It's buying into a system, training, software, maintenance, upgrades, supply chains, and rules that may sit entirely outside its own borders. And once that system is in place, backing out becomes painfully expensive, sometimes practically impossible. Here's where the tension starts. Canadians were told a story of certainty, a story of control, a story that this was a smart, manageable, well-understood decision. And yet, behind closed doors, governments in two highly developed democracies, Canada and Switzerland, began discovering problems only after commitments were already made. That should make anyone pause. These aren't weak states. These are wealthy, educated, legally sophisticated countries with experienced defense departments. And still, both found themselves grappling with rising costs, unclear obligations, and limited leverage after the fact. So the question isn't, did someone mess up? The real question is far more uncomfortable. How can decisions this large feel so certain at the start and so constrained later on? Defense procurement is one of the most complex things a government can do. It mixes national security, international politics, law, and industrial policy into one massive package. That complexity creates an illusion of confidence. Numbers look precise, contracts look firm, officials speak with authority, but complexity can also hide risk. When citizens hear phrases like fixed price, predictable life cycle, or interoperability with allies, it sounds reassuring. It feels like adults are in charge, like all the angles have been covered. Yet history shows that in systems this large, certainty is often more of a performance than a reality. And here's why this matters to you, even if you don't care about jets at all. Decisions like this don't just affect defense budgets, they shape what a country can afford to do elsewhere. Healthcare, infrastructure, education, industrial development. Every dollar locked into long-term obligations is a dollar that can't be used somewhere else. And when those obligations are hard to change, democratic choice quietly shrinks. That's why this story isn't about being for or against a particular aircraft. Not yet. Taking sides too early misses the point. The real issue is whether the process itself respected transparency, accountability, and informed consent, the basic foundations of democratic control. Were risks clearly communicated? Were long-term dependencies fully understood? And were citizens given an honest picture before momentum made the decision feel inevitable? The uncomfortable truth is this. Once a government starts acting as if a decision is already made, even before it legally is, reversing course becomes politically and institutionally difficult. At that point, review starts to look like delay. Questions start to look like disloyalty. and scrutiny gets framed as a problem rather than a safeguard. That's why this moment matters. What we're watching isn't indecision. It's a rare pause, a moment where a government is being forced, internally and publicly, to re-examine assumptions that once seemed settled. And that pause exists only because cracks started appearing in the story of certainty. In the next part, we need to go back to the beginning, to the original promise Canadians were given, and to understand why so many people believed it, and why that belief made sense at the time. That's where this journey really starts. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind to the beginning, to the story Canadians were originally told. The fighter replacement program was presented as something almost boring in its predictability. Not a gamble, not an experiment, just a necessary update. The Royal Canadian Air Force had aging aircraft, and like replacing an old fleet of buses or snowplows, the message was clear. This was routine maintenance for a modern country. Officials emphasized three reassuring ideas again and again. First, cost control. Canadians were told the price would be manageable, stable, and planned well in advance. No wild surprises, no blank checks. Second, a predictable life cycle. The jets would be bought, operated, and maintained under a clearly understood framework. Long-term costs, we were told, had been studied carefully. And third, minimal disruption. Existing bases, training systems, and personnel would transition smoothly. This wasn't supposed to require tearing everything down and starting over. That message mattered. Because when a government tells you a program is expensive but predictable, most people accept it. Canadians understand that defense costs money. What they expect in return is competence and foresight. And to be fair, there were good reasons many people trusted those assurances. The F-35 wasn't some experimental prototype. Other Allied countries were already buying it. The manufacturer was well known. The program was backed by the world's largest military power. On the surface, it looked like choosing the safest, most established option, the equivalent of buying a popular car model with lots of existing users and support. Confidence was not subtle. It was repeated, reinforced, embedded into official language. Over time, that confidence hardened into something stronger: assumption. Once an assumption enters the system, it starts shaping everything around it. Budgets get planned with it in mind. Timelines get built around it. Alternatives start to feel unnecessary or unrealistic. The decision slowly stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a conclusion. And that's where the first quiet problem emerged. Early on, there were signs that the picture wasn't as clean as it seemed. Internal discussions raised questions about long-term sustainment costs, infrastructure needs, and operational complexity. But these weren't front and center in public messaging. They were treated as manageable details, things to be solved later, once the main decision was settled. This wasn't deception. It's important to be clear about that. This was optimism. Optimism that costs would stabilize. Optimism that infrastructure could be adapted efficiently. Optimism that long-term dependencies wouldn't become long-term constraints. In large systems, optimism is powerful and dangerous, because once it's baked into official planning, it becomes very hard to challenge without sounding alarmist. No one wants to be the person who slows progress, complicates a narrative, or raises doubts that might derail momentum. So the original promise held. Publicly, everything was under control. The program was framed as modern, smart, and responsibly managed, and for a time there was little reason for the average Canadian to think otherwise. But here's the critical turning point in the story. When early assumptions go untested long enough, they don't stay assumptions. They become institutional truths. And when reality finally pushes back, it doesn't do so gently. The problem wasn't that the promise was made in bad faith. The problem was that the promise was accepted before it was fully proven. And once that happened, the system began moving forward on momentum rather than certainty. In the next section, we'll see exactly when that momentum collided with reality. When the numbers stopped behaving, the costs began climbing, and the reassuring story of predictability started to fracture. That's where the discomfort really begins. This is the moment in the story where the math stops feeling boring, and honestly, starts feeling unsettling. At first, the price tag looked big, but understandable. Tens of billions of dollars spread over decades. That's not pocket change, but for a major national defense program, it sounded planned, structured, and within reason. Then the numbers started to move. Revised estimates pushed the total higher, then higher again. What was once framed as a controlled long-term cost began drifting upward into territory that made even experienced analysts uncomfortable. And the most troubling part wasn't just the increase itself, it was the uncertainty attached to it. Internal documents began acknowledging wide ranges instead of firm totals. Projections came with caveats. Officials could explain why costs might rise, but not confidently say how far. That's a red flag. In normal household terms, imagine telling your family, "We're buying a car that will cost between $30,000 and $60,000. We're not sure which yet, but we've already committed." That wouldn't feel like responsible planning. It would feel reckless. At this scale, uncertainty isn't normal. Governments plan large infrastructure projects, ships, and aircraft all the time. While costs can change, the inability to clearly explain the full life cycle cost of a program after years of analysis points to something deeper than bad forecasting. This is where the story shifts from accounting to governance. Because when a government cannot clearly tell its citizens what a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar commitment will truly cost, the problem is no longer technical. It becomes an accountability issue. Citizens cannot meaningfully evaluate a decision if the information keeps changing after commitments are made. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Defense spending doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every dollar locked into higher than expected sustainment costs is a dollar that can't be used elsewhere. Hospitals don't get built. Infrastructure projects get delayed. Other defense capabilities get squeezed. Budgets are finite, even in wealthy countries. That's why cost opacity matters. It quietly narrows future choices. What made this even more concerning was that the uncertainty didn't disappear with time. Normally, as a program matures, costs become clearer. Risks get narrowed. The picture sharpens. Here, the opposite happened. Even after revised estimates, officials continued to acknowledge that large parts of the long-term sustainment cost remained unclear. Infrastructure upgrades weren't fully priced in. Training pipelines were still assumptions. Maintenance timelines relied on optimistic projections. In other words, the more Canada learned, the less certain the total picture became. This is not a simple case of inflation or global supply chain disruption. Those factors exist, but they don't explain why core elements of the program were still being discovered after the direction had already been set. That's why calling this a cost overrun misses the point. Cost overruns suggest something went wrong after a solid plan was in place. What this looks like instead is a plan that was never as complete as it needed to be before momentum took over. And momentum is powerful. Once a program reaches a certain stage, stopping or seriously questioning it becomes politically risky. Billions already spent get framed as sunk costs. Alternatives get dismissed as impractical. The conversation shifts from, "Is this the right choice?" to "How do we manage the consequences?" That shift is dangerous, because democracy depends on informed consent. If consent is given based on incomplete or overly optimistic information, accountability weakens. Not because people were careless, but because the system didn't slow down when it should have. At this point in the story, skepticism is no longer hypothetical, it's earned. And Canada wasn't the only country learning this lesson. In the next section, we're going to look at what happened when another highly capable democracy believed it had locked in certainty, only to discover that certainty can evaporate when real-world power dynamics come into play. That example changes everything. If rising costs were the first warning sign, Switzerland's experience was the proof that those warnings couldn't be ignored. Switzerland did everything by the book. They're known for precision, cautious governance, and strong public oversight. When they chose the F-35, their government assured citizens that the deal was fixed price, clear, firm, protected from surprises. That phrase, fixed price, matters. It signals control. It tells taxpayers, we know what this will cost, and we've locked it in. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then reality intervened. Unexpected financial adjustments began to surface. Costs that were assumed to be settled suddenly weren't. Policy changes and pricing mechanisms outside Switzerland's direct control reshaped the deal. What looked fixed on paper turned out to be flexible in practice. And Switzerland discovered something uncomfortable. Their leverage was limited. This wasn't because Switzerland was careless or naive. It was because of the structure of the relationship. When you rely on a single foreign supplier for an extremely complex system, one controlled by another government's regulations, priorities, and industrial rules, contractual certainty has limits. A contract in this context is not just a legal document, it's a reflection of power. And power doesn't always sit evenly between partners, even friendly ones. What made the situation worse was what came out afterward. Audits revealed that internal warnings about cost risks had been raised earlier, months before the public was told everything was settled. Those concerns never reached citizens in real time. By the time the issue became visible, Switzerland was already deep into the commitment. That's the critical lesson. The failure wasn't that costs changed. In complex defense programs, that can happen. The failure was the gap between what decision-makers knew internally and what the public was told externally. That gap erodes trust, and it forces a hard question for Canada. If Switzerland, with a fixed-price agreement, strong institutions, and a culture of caution, couldn't fully enforce certainty, what makes us believe Canada is immune to the same structural risks? This isn't about accusing the United States of bad faith. That's an important point. Allies act in their own interests, just as Canada does. Policy changes, industrial pressures, and strategic priorities shift over time. That's normal. The issue is dependency. When essential capabilities depend on another country's supply chains, rules, and political decisions, the smaller partner absorbs most of the risk, even when the contract says otherwise. Switzerland believed the paperwork protected them. They learned, the hard way, that paperwork alone doesn't equal leverage. For Canada, this example landed like a warning flare. It showed that cost certainty can collapse even after signatures are in place. It showed that internal doubts can stay buried until it's too late. And it showed that once you're deep into a system this complex, your ability to push back is far weaker than it looks at the beginning. At this point in the story, skepticism isn't theoretical anymore. It's grounded in real experience. And it forces the conversation to move beyond price tags and contracts towards something more fundamental. Can Canada actually support, operate, and sustain this system on its own terms? That's the question we turn to next, because this is where procurement stops being abstract and starts becoming a real national security issue. Up to this point, the debate has mostly lived on spreadsheets and contracts. But now it hits the ground, literally. Because owning an advanced fighter jet and being able to actually use it are two very different things. The F-35 is not like swapping out one pickup truck for another. It's more like buying a high-performance electric race car and then realizing your garage, your tools, and even your mechanics aren't ready for it. The car might be incredible, but without the right support, it spends more time parked than driving. That's the problem Canada began to confront. Canada's main fighter bases, especially Cold Lake in Alberta and Bagotville in Quebec, weren't built for this aircraft. The F-35 requires specialized hangars, secure facilities, advanced maintenance environments, and highly specific IT infrastructure. These are not optional upgrades. They are non-negotiable requirements, and they are expensive. Rebuilding or heavily upgrading major air bases takes years, not months. It means construction delays, cost overruns, and disruptions to current operations. Yet many of these requirements were either underestimated or treated as future problems when the aircraft decision was first made. Then there's the human side. Advanced aircraft need advanced people. Pilots don't appear overnight. Neither do maintainers, technicians, or instructors. Training pipelines are long, fragile, and already under strain. When projections assume sufficient capacity without fully accounting for current shortages, that's not planning. That's hope. And hope is not a strategy. Maintenance is another major factor. The F-35 relies heavily on proprietary systems, specialized parts, and tightly controlled sustainment processes. That means Canada's ability to keep aircraft mission-ready is deeply tied to external supply chains and timelines. This is where dependency stops being theoretical. If a plane can't be repaired quickly because parts are delayed, software access is restricted, or approvals come from abroad, readiness suffers. And readiness is what actually defends a country, not purchase announcements or spec sheets. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A smaller fleet of aircraft that are consistently ready often provides more real security than a larger fleet that spends too much time grounded. When infrastructure, training, and sustainment fall behind, the most advanced platform in the world becomes a liability rather than an asset. This is why underestimating these costs is so dangerous. It creates the illusion of strength while quietly weakening real capability. And once the aircraft are delivered, the pressure to make it work becomes immense, regardless of whether the system was truly ready. At this point, the story changes again. This is no longer just about money. It's about whether Canada can independently support a core defense capability, or whether it becomes permanently reliant on external systems to keep its own aircraft flying. That realization is what forced deeper questions inside government. Not is the F-35 advanced, but is this system aligned with Canada's infrastructure, workforce, and long-term independence? To answer that, we have to step back even further and examine why systems like this keep drifting toward risk in the first place, even when smart people are involved. That's where we go next. So where does this leave us? After all the numbers, the contracts, the foreign examples, and the infrastructure realities, one truth becomes clear. This debate was never really about jets. It's about how a democracy makes decisions that last longer than any single government. This story isn't about whether the F-35 is a capable aircraft. It clearly is. It's about whether Canadians were given a complete, honest picture of what committing to this system truly means, financially, legally, and strategically, before momentum made the decision feel inevitable. Transparency is not a luxury in democratic governance. It's the foundation. When governments underestimate costs, minimize known risks, or delay uncomfortable disclosures, even unintentionally, public trust begins to erode. And once that trust is weakened, every future decision becomes harder to justify, no matter how sound it may be. That's why this moment matters so much. A responsible government doesn't just ask, can we afford this today? It asks, what does this lock us into for the next 30 or 40 years? It asks whether long-term sustainment costs will quietly squeeze future budgets, whether domestic industries are being developed or hollowed out, whether national defense choices increase resilience or dependency. And most importantly, it asks those questions before the point of no return. This is not about being anti-military or anti-alliance. Canada's partnerships matter. Interoperability matters. Security matters. But so does economic sovereignty. So does democratic oversight. And so does the ability for future governments and future Canadians to still have meaningful choices. Public scrutiny isn't obstruction, it's patriotism. As citizens, we don't need to agree on the final answer. Reasonable people can disagree about aircraft, alliances, and trade-offs. What we should agree on is that decisions of this magnitude demand full transparency, rigorous debate, and honest acknowledgement of risk. So the real question going forward isn't simply, which aircraft should Canada choose? It's this: how do we build a procurement system that earns public trust, resists institutional drift, and puts long-term national resilience ahead of short-term certainty? That question affects every Canadian, whether or not they ever think about fighter jets. And that's why this conversation matters. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe deeper domestic industrial capacity is worth the trade-offs it may bring? How much dependency is acceptable in national defense? And how can Canada ensure that future decisions of this scale are truly informed, transparent, and accountable? Join the discussion below, because this decision isn't just being made in government buildings. In a democracy, it ultimately belongs to all of us.